Now that we've talked about what neurons are, we're going to talk about what neurons do. And to talk about that, we have to talk about the neuronal membrane because, as we will learn, most of the important things that a neuron does happen at its membrane. But before we do that, let's talk about, in a nutshell, how the nervous system, or how neurons anyway, communicate. So let's look at, as an example, just a basic reflex. Basically, a reflex is any circuit that involves some sensory system, like a pain receptor or a touch receptor, directly connecting to a muscle, and that sensory receptor triggers that muscle to contract. And this is usually exemplified by this kind of reflex, which is pretty straightforward. So you start with, let's say you're walking around your house naked for some reason, and you step on a tack or something sharp on your floor. So that painful stimulus will activate pain sensory receptors in the skin of your foot, and then that signal travels along an axon all the way up your leg to a sensory neuron, which is in this little structure called the dorsal ganglion. We'll talk about sensory systems in more detail later, but that neuron then has another branch of its axon that goes into the spinal cord, and it synapses with a motor neuron via this interneuron. So there's this purple neuron then synapses with a motor neuron, which is also in the spinal cord, and its axon goes back out into the leg to a muscle. And in this case, that muscle happens to be what we call the flexor muscle of the leg, the one that makes your knee bend, because the reaction to this stimulus would be hopefully to lift your leg away from the painful stimulus. So that's what that muscle does. Meanwhile, the interneuron sends a signal to the brain. And then after that, you get the message, or your brain gets the message that you've stepped on something, and maybe you need to either start wearing shoes or pick up all the tacks off your floor. But what's important here is that this all happened. In fact, the signal that went from your foot to your spinal cord back down to your leg again to the muscle all happened very quickly. In fact, it probably happened before you were even aware that you'd stepped on anything at all. So in a fraction of a second, this information has to get from your foot, several feet to your spinal cord and then back down again. So how does it move so quickly? It can't be just in molecules moving through your leg, because we learned in the last chapter that axons are long. Molecules move slowly even under active transport, so there's no way it can be a molecular signal. So the only thing it can be is an electrical signal. That's the only thing that moves quickly enough to allow this kind of information to travel that distance. And that is exactly what the signal is that travels along axons. It's an electrical signal. However, so the obvious comparison is to electrical current. And so if you know how electrical current works, it's just the movement of electrical charge through a conductor. So, current running through a wire is the simplest example of that. So if you have a light bulb connected to a power source, electrical current will run from one end of that wire to the other, and it will power the light bulb. And if you flick a switch to break that current, the current stops flowing, and if you flick it back and reconnect it, then the current almost instantaneously gets from the power source to the light bulb. And an action potential is the electrical signal that travels along axons, and it involves electrical current, but it's not quite the same thing. So an action potential, for one thing, it's slower, so electrical currents move much more quickly than action potentials. And the action potential is not the same kind of just passive movement of current from one place to another. It involves basically a wave in fluctuating membrane potential that travels along the membrane of the axon. So we'll talk about action potentials in a lot more detail in the next chapter, but to understand action potentials, we have to talk about what's happening at the membrane or along the membrane of an axon, and how the electrical potential of the axon or the membrane allows for this kind of signal to be created. So before we get to the membrane, though, we have to talk about some of the basic chemistry of the molecules that are found in and around the membrane, and of course the most abundant molecule in every cell in your body, and even in the fluid between your cells, is water. So you probably know your body is made up mostly of water. All living things are made up mostly of water. Cells are basically just little bags of water and some stuff. And so water is probably the most important molecule for life generally. And it's special, water is special because in part of its structure. So you probably know that water, a molecule of water, is two hydrogen atoms attached to a single oxygen atom. So that's what we call it H2O. And the reason that structure is important is because of the properties of oxygen. It forms this triangular shape here. And also, oxygen is highly electronegative. That means that even though water is a neutral molecule, so the number of electrons and the number of protons in a water molecule are equal, its net charge is zero, but oxygen is attracted to electrons so much more than the hydrogen atoms that the electrons that they share, and you should know that a covalent bond between two atoms like this is them just sharing those electrons. But even though they share those electrons, the electrons prefer that oxygen atom, so they spend a little bit more time on this side of the molecule. So even though there's no net charge, the electrons in the molecule spend a little more time closer to the oxygen atom. And so a water molecule has an uneven distribution of charge. That means one side is slightly negative and one side is slightly positive. Then the oxygen atom is slightly negative and the two hydrogens are slightly positive. So what we say is that water is a polar molecule. It has two poles, a positive pole and a negative pole. Again, even though the net charge is zero. A nonpolar molecule like carbon dioxide has three atoms again. So you have a central carbon and two oxygens sticking off. But because of the three-dimensional arrangement of those atoms, they're all in a straight line. And so even though, again, there's a difference in electronegativity between the carbon and the oxygen, because they're positioned in opposite directions, they cancel each other out. And so that is a non-polar molecule. And what's important about polar molecules is that they are attracted to each other, and non-polar molecules are not. And so water is liquid because water molecules are attracted to each other. And water is also an excellent solvent, which means that if you put anything in water that's polar or anything with an electrical charge, those atoms or molecules will be surrounded by water molecules. So if you put a salt of sodium chloride, for example, in water, the reason that salt dissolves in water is that the water molecules are attracted to both the positive sodium ions and the negative chloride ions, and they kind of surround those atoms and pull them apart from each other, get in the way of each other, and that's what makes water such a great solvent. In fact, that's, again, what the fluid in your cells is. It's water with a bunch of stuff, polar molecules, for example, and ions, dissolved in it. And so the water in your cells and surrounding your cells is kind of the medium that all of this is happening in. And then the other important player in the membrane potential, or the behavior of the membrane, are ions. So I already mentioned ions. Again, ions are important because they're soluble in water. But what you probably know about ions is it's just any atom or molecule that has an uneven or an unequal number of protons and electrons. That means it has a net electrical charge. If it has a net positive charge, that means it has more protons than electrons. We say it's a cation. If it has a net negative charge, so there are extra electrons, we call it an anion. And then you can also talk about an ion in terms of its net charge. So the valency of an ion is what its net charge is. A monovalent ion has a charge of plus or minus 1. Divalent ions are plus or minus 2. You can have trivalent and tetravalent and so on, but those are not as important for, at least for cells. And these are just some examples of ions. Of course, there are many, many ions that are possible, but these four are especially important for neurons. The two main monovalent cations are sodium and potassium. The main anion that we are concerned with for the membrane is chloride. And then the only divalent ion that really matters much to us that we'll be talking about is calcium. So all of these are found in your cells, in the tissue surrounding your cells. And they are going to be floating around the membrane, and they are going to contribute to the electrical properties of the membrane, as we will learn. And then the other important part of the membrane are the molecules that make up the membrane itself, which are these things called phospholipids. So phospholipids are kind of complicated looking molecules, but really the important parts are this big group up here called, in this case, called the phosphatidylcholine group, and these two long chains of carbon atoms that are hanging off called the tails. So what's important about this molecule is it's what we call amphipathic. So part of it, what that means is part of it is polar, the so-called head group that contains the phosphatidylcholine. This group is called phosphatidylcholine, and it's connected to these tails, these hydrocarbon tails, by this glycerol group. And the tails are nonpolar, so that's why this molecule is called amphipathic. It has a polar part and a nonpolar part. In fact, the other term for the other word that we use interchangeably with polar is hydrophilic, which literally means water-loving. Again, that's because anything that's polar is going to be attracted to water molecules as well as other polar molecules. And then the tails we call hydrophobic, which literally means water-fearing because they are not polar. And if something is non-polar, that means that water molecules are not going to be attracted to them. And the water molecules, when exposed to any non-polar molecules, will kind of push them together, mostly so they can interact with each other more. So actually calling them hydrophobic is kind of misleading because they are not afraid of water. In fact, it's the other way around. Water molecules are afraid of them. Or if you like it better, you can say that the water molecules just prefer each other and prefer other polar molecules so much more than hydrophobic molecules or non-polar molecules that they push them together. That's why if you mix oil and water, oil molecules are non-polar. The oil molecules separate into a layer, usually above the water, because water is also much more dense than most non-polar molecules, and they can't mix. But when you mix an amphipathic molecule like a phospholipid into water, they form structures where the non-polar tails get as far away as they can from the water, and the polar heads orient themselves toward the water. So you end up with this structure called a phospholipid bilayer. This whole thing over here is a phospholipid bilayer. And that's because there are two layers, and each one contains these phospholipid molecules. And they, again, have their head groups facing out to where the water is. And the tails, meanwhile, are on the inside of the layer where they can avoid water. So this is what the membrane of all cells, in fact, looks like. This is not just unique to neurons. Every cell of every organism has a phospholipid bilayer that looks basically like this. And its job is just to keep the inside of the cell separate from the outside of the cell, because it forms spontaneously, so you don't need special proteins or anything to assemble the cell membrane. These molecules just spontaneously keep this shape because, again, they prefer that when they're surrounded by water. And more importantly, water and other polar molecules and ions cannot go through the lipid bilayer on their own. So the water molecules, again, because they are polar, they do not like to be around those non-polar tails, and so they will just stop when they get to the polar heads. So that's what forms the membrane of every cell. It's what defines the boundary of the cell and what keeps the inside separate from the outside. So the phospholipid bilayer, again, looks kind of like this. Just to kind of review, you've got your polar heads and your non-polar tails. Polar heads facing either into the cell or out of the cell, depending on which side you're on. Water molecules, again, cannot get through on their own. And then anything else, so ions or any other charged or polar molecule that's either inside or outside the cell, will not be able to go through either. And so that just, again, kind of sets the stage for what's happening at the membrane of the cell. So next time we will talk about the other major component of the cell membrane, which are proteins.